Hey, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Speaking of. My name is Steve Weissman. I'll be your host for today, and I'm happy and thrilled, actually, to be joined by Ann Snyder. You may know Ann from her years in our information space, up until recently, one of the movers and shakers at Arma, but now free on the dark side, like the rest of us consultants. She is the president, principal, chief. I'm not sure what the title is at IG Standard. Welcome, Anne.
Yeah, it's Grand Overseer, and I expect to be addressed as Your Holiness during this whole conversation. So no, it's principle's fine. Principle works. So, and I don't consider it the dark side, Steve. I don't think consulting is the dark side um, of our work. I actually think it's cool to be out there again, just helping organizations, just address some of their information challenges. So I consider that the light side.
And the only problem I have with calling you Your Holiness is I don't see any holes except the one where your head sticks through. And
Okay.
so that's fine.
Mm.
These are the jokes, folks. Anyway, the real reason we're here, um, and you recently participated in an event that had freedom of information kinds of things at its core.
Mm.
And when we chatted about it the other day, I began to get um, excited about the crossover really that
Mhm.
existed between the things that you talked about during the event and the things that are important to all of us as information governors, if you will.
Mhm.
Um, what if you could just fill us in a little bit about that?
Sure.
What
This
event?
this was yeah. This was the sorry, Steve. I didn't mean to talk
No,
over you.
it's
This
fine.
is the Right to Know Week celebration, and this was put together by PSIC, which is the Public Service Information Community Connection, and it's connected to other right to know stuff that was going on last week. And Dustin Rivers and I had chatted. So this is the brainchild of Dustin Rivers and Chris Lutz, and Dustin asked me if I would be interested maybe in emceeing one of the days, and then just sort of just leading some of the two of the discussions, the panel discussions. So the Right to Know Week celebration is about, of course, gaining access to information that the government has. I think that's the primary focus of it. So having access to that information, and why that's important, and sort of course, that an informed citizenry is an underpinning of any kind of free society and a vibrant democracy. And I guess it was Jefferson said something like it's the best bulwark against tyranny. And so that's what the week was about, celebrating efforts that are being made to make sure that the citizens have access to the information that the government has about them, so that they can make meaningful and informed decisions.
Well, first, I have to say that they're asking you couldn't have been more spot on. For those of you who don't know, Anne actually is an attorney. Speaking of the dark side, um,
I'm your attorney, but I am an attorney, but I'm not your attorney. So sorry, I flipped that. Take that back.
that's right. Um, but also, I know that you have an activist past of a sort in this area. So that's one thing, because I can't think of somebody who would have been better suited than you to MC such a program. The other is, when we spoke, I thought this is really interesting. You know, certainly at the high level in terms of people in society and all that, goodness. An informed citizenry is sort of key to the whole thing.
Hmm.
But to a large degree, the same thing is true in the more down to earth spaces that we tend to operate in. We, you and I, but also, all of you out there who are watching this.
Hmm.
And so I begin to let my mind wander into, well, how does that translate? And so when you started talking about data literacy,
Hmm.
and I'm thinking inside an organization, because it's great that you collected all of this stuff, but if you don't know what to do with it, it's sort of a waste. But then also for customers or consumers or clients or stakeholders, whatever you call them in your particular business.
Right.
Now, we can't teach them how to become informed consumers necessarily, but it seems to me we can set things up as records people and information governance people to make it as easy as possible for somebody from the outside to find what they're looking for so they can do something meaningful with it.
Mhm. Well, I think that there are, I don't know, 75 issues like all squished into
Yeah,
that
yeah.
that one. Let me see if I can peel that onion back a little. So, I think so. The conference again was in the idea of celebrating the right to know is, one element of is obviously access to the information, but in the same way that we deal with these ideas in the, well, let me table the private sector idea, but we need, as information governance professionals, whether we're in public or private, we are not just, we're dealing with the strategic use of information, but it's down to like getting the right information in the right hands at the right time in the right form. So it's not just about eventually getting access. There's a timeliness of it. We have to understand that it is what it's supposed to be. It's got to be in a right format that we can do stuff with it. And then in terms of the sort of the data literacy, which was the subject of one of the panels, is we need to be able to make sense of that data. And that doesn't just mean, sort of being able to chug the numbers, but also being able to ask the right kinds of questions around that data. And those are things that I think govern, apply to the information within organizations, if we want to confine it, to, if we're going to think about private organizations, but it applies to public organizations using their data too. All of those things apply for sure. And then the sort of, again, that's the sort of the public private leap. I for me, it's almost a distinction without a difference in terms of how we, um, the kinds of things that we need to do with our information. The sort of, we think of ourselves though with respect to our government as needing the information so that we can be an active, informed citizenry. But certainly the private sector collects a lot of information about us too at this point. And I think that knowing what's being collected and being able to make meaningful, informed decisions about that with respect to the private sector as well is probably as relevant, if not more, today than it might have been in the past. So, and then to go back to the sort of, sorry, the activisty part, or sort of just to, so yes, I was a troublemaker back in the day, but more recently, activisty as a lawyer, in the sense that I worked on free speech issues, and sort of that there's a nexus between the concerns that I think some of them that were raised at the conference, including the data literacy one. So like, yeah, you have access to the information. Now, what can you do with it for it to be meaningful? I think I see the connection between those kinds of questions and free speech protections, because if you can't meaningfully discuss the data that you have access to, if we mute our conversations, or those conversations are shaped by people for you, the access to the information or the format. There are all kinds of implications of that can shape the dialogue that we have as citizens, and ultimately the decisions we make. So those are kinds of things that, as not just with respect to our government and information that the government's collecting, but other private actors too, the ability to actually use that information and make a sensible use of it, requires understanding kind of how it's been processed and moved and selected for us, uh, before we get it. So,
It's interesting too. Certainly, my mind tends to run immediately to the darker edges of this, um, and I think that's fair. And I think,
mhm.
in my own defense, there are things to point to that would say that makes sense. um,
You mean the darker edges of how information gets used?
well, yeah,
Well, I mean,
yeah,
look, I mean, it's fair to run to the darker edges, because I think, like we can fantasize that, like I would love to do a fully measured year or a couple of years where I'm collecting all the data points on the stuff that I'm doing. But then I think about, where does that information get stored? Who has access to it on this or that app, and how's it going to be used? So I think it's important to be cognizant of that. And if we don't have meaningful ways to sort of get rid of that information, to know what's been collected, to get rid of it when we say that we're done with it, or the default is to collect the information, not yet, and to use a service that everybody basically has to use to function in society. You have to opt in. How many times have you been on a phone call where it says, you know, for quality insurance reasons, we're recording this conversation. It doesn't, like you were just told on this call, hey, tell your people that they're being recorded, as opposed to the default being that we are informed. And so it defaults to doing the thing, and maybe you get warned about
Right.
it. Sorry, that was rambly. Apologize.
No, that's okay. And just so everybody knows, I did inform Anne that this was being recorded. That's sort of the whole point. Um,
Right.
anyway, where I was headed first, like any other technology, really, there are benefits to doing this, and we won't
Yeah.
go into. I mean, it's another conversation, but like when you do business intelligence correctly, you're basing it on data, and it has to be good data so you can make a good decision, and blah blah blah. Um, but because of the dark side of it, which looms large, I mean, that's sort of the genesis of things like GDPR. Things like, it's more of a European thing also, the notion of a subject access request, where, say, an employee in a large organization or a small one can literally on the back of a napkin write something as simple as, I'd like to see all the information you have on me, please. And there are time limits within which the organization has to respond. So, what where I feel that kind of thing is important is those informed people, be they citizens or employees or customers or what have you, are beginning to take more control and more responsibility over the information about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Most, I suspect, don't know that they can or should.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a whole different issue as well. But part of what intrigued me when you were telling me about this event, when you got back and we had this kind of conversation, was to begin to think slightly differently about what can we as records people or information garners do to help
You have to say
facilitate.
it as you have to say governor.
Governor, I say governor. Um, apologies to all British citizens for that poor accent. Um, but clearly there are ramifications there for organizations that want to be viewed as doing the right thing because they're actually doing it and not because they have a clever PR campaign. I think it's important to start thinking about this. And one of the things that you had said was to start thinking about this before you actually do stuff.
Right.
So rather than collect all the information and we'll worry about it later,
Mm-hmm.
because nobody ever does, because retrofitting is impossible, to start thinking about that now and design the way you approach information management with these sorts of precepts in mind.
Mm-hmm. Well,
That
I
was
mean,
sort of rambling.
yeah. Well, when I want to go back to the sort of dark side of the data collection, because I think it ties in here, and also because they have pizza. That's what I heard. So the dark side of it. So again, like I like, I like living an informed life and a measured life, and have really thought about just sort of strapping all kinds of electrodes onto myself and measuring certain things that I'm working on right now, and I would love to have those. But what, and there are these aspects of my life that are really measured, and stuff gets served up to me like, hey, you like that book, maybe you'd like this, and and those are, hey, Anne likes cats. We all know that, right? So I'm going to get cat stuff served up to me all the time, and that's lovely. But you know, there's an awful lot of information that's being collected about me in the first place, and I think that we have to ask ourselves as a society, and then I think as organizations, um, you know, hopefully governed somewhat by, their, or not governed somewhat, but governed by the concerns of the consumer and things like that, and what the people whose data they're collecting might want, whether we should be collecting this information in the first place. And that's the prior collection. And I think our default, as it's been for not deleting information, save everything sort of, we've had the same kind of default on collect everything. So we've certainly seen that in the last year. Everybody's moving to remote um, activities. We're using different modes of communication, and we're default creating online conversations, chats, which, people are not so careful about, but the default is that it's on, right? Or the default is that the record is on, or, just like I said on, phone calls, I call into my credit card company, the default is that it's recording. I don't have an opt out on any of that. I understand why the call is being recorded, but it would be really nice if I could say maybe not on this one. So I do think that there is a prior question that we have to ask as a society with respect to our government. Should the government be collecting this kind of information in the first place, which is some of the stuff that led to GDPR, government surveillance, and a response to that. But we as in the private sector have to be asking those questions. So if we collect it now, we have a duty to handle it in a certain way and respond to requests and things like that with respect to that information. But I think the primary question should we be collecting it in the first place? It certainly makes the management challenge easier if we don't collect, every little piece of electronic paper effectively about everybody. And then it also reduces some of the risks. You can't breach what you don't have. You don't have to protect the stuff that you don't have. So, think twice about grabbing that information for some kind of incidental gain. And then from a societal perspective, I ask the question, like, do we, how important is it that I get, something served up to me because I liked a thing in the past, or I Googled something in the past? That's a convenience. Maybe it shelters me and puts me like in an echo chamber of my own thoughts. But what's the gain of that? That I'm surveilled and watched. I can drive from here up to Massachusetts to come visit you. You don't want me to do that, I'm sure, but
Well, we're
I
close.
could, I could, and I don't even have to drive with an easy pass. Because stuff just gets, like, once I'm in Massachusetts, it just automatically takes pictures of my my license plate. Now, so what? I'm, not, maybe I'm not doing something wrong, but it's the idea that you shouldn't be surveilled just because you're not doing something wrong is nonsense. And I think it was Snowden who said, just not being concerned, is paraphrasing very poorly paraphrasing him, something like, just you're not being concerned about privacy because you're not doing anything wrong is like saying I don't need free speech protection because I don't have anything meaningful to say. And I think this idea came up in our conversation. Watch pots do in fact boil. We know that actually happens. And they boil at the same rate, but watched people, surveilled people don't behave in the same ways. They don't have, it's not just they don't do shady things. Some people might be deterred from those kinds of things, but they're deterred from meaningful conversation. When people are observed, they behave in a completely different way. Like I'm behaving in a completely different way, even in this conversation, right? So, as opposed to the off the cuff conversations that we might have, some evening with our friends. So this is Anne observed, and we see that it's slightly different than Anne just riffing and being herself, right?
We like both ends, in fact. And and we're very glad that you're here. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's funny. A lot of the issues that we touch on in this series lend themselves to kind of often um, neat wrap ups.
Mm-hmm.
So think about X, Y, and Z fairly cut and dry as a topic to take back, the folks who are watching and when we serve our clients. I'm not sure this is one of those. It's a very important issue, but I don't think it's nearly as black and white as some of the others. And personally, I think that's a good thing
Mm-hmm.
because really, to do information governance right, conversations like this need to take place up front
Mm-hmm.
about how is this going to be used and by whom when you design really all of it.
Mm-hmm.
In order to facilitate that, get the right information to the right people at the right time bit.
Mm-hmm.
We're probably already over a lot of time, which is also nothing new. People who have watched these all along will be well aware of.
Mm-hmm.
But I do want to conclude with the last question because you had mentioned to me a resource that I think you wanted to share with folks. Only I can't think of the woman's name.
Oh, okay. Well, this was I think what sort of sparked all of this discussion was the Right to Know Week celebration, and one of the panels that I was on data, an open education and data literacy. And so, one of and this was, I think, the nexus with my advocacy and free speech stuff was, sort of, okay, you've gotten access to the information, huzzah, right? Now, what do you do with it? And, there was a whole panel again on data literacy. So it's like making sense of the data after you actually access it, and that means understanding not only and the person we were talking about is Chantilly Jaggernaut. There were others on the panel, of course, but she has a group, an organization that's called Millennials and Data, and she does a data literacy course, I guess it's a couple week course for millennials, and we were all trying to convince her to um, have a course for the rest of people. So, and I think there's, we know that there are obviously gaps in data literacy. It's not just, again, it's not just that the vast majority of people haven't, gone, don't have as comfortable a love for math as some of us might, and certainly, a lot of people didn't even get to statistics 101, let alone more advanced understanding. But there's also just being able to, and this is part of the conversation we had the other day, was looking at data with a critical eye, being able to sort of smell the thing that's under the leaves, despite the fact that you can't see it, to know, wait a second, this doesn't sound, what I'm telling you might be smelling under the leaves. Cookies, right? So, but the idea is, you know something's there even though you can't see it, and it's the sort of the investigative like sort of mindset, or the critical querying mindset, where and curious mindset too, to just ask that next question. And so she had some really cool ideas just about how to get people excited about data, and so did others on the panels, sort of giving them data sets that they find meaningful. So with you, I'd give you some baseball stats to analyze if I wanted to get you excited. But what was neat about it, she was the one example she was giving people, I think high school students, she was giving them some Spotify data that was related to songs and genres, and she had intentionally adjusted the data set to misassign things to the wrong genre, or rank a song that she said maybe sucked as one of the, she used that term, as one of the top ranked songs. And what was neat is, because the kids were close to the data set, they were excited about it, so they were paying attention, but they also knew something about it, so they were able to understand that there was something wrong with it, and spot those errors. So it just kind of got them all excited about or at least taught the lesson that just because it's data, just because it's numbers, you might not be able to trust it, and which they wouldn't have been able to see if they hadn't looked at a data set with which they were familiar. So
Putting
anyway,
the spot in Spotify.
What was that?
Putting
right.
the spot in Spotify.
So there are people who are out there doing some really great stuff, and so that was Chantilly and Millennials and Data. So that's that. Hopefully when we post this, we'll do a tag to her and some of the other people who are on that panel.
Sure.
So.
And Snyder, IG Standard, thanks for playing our game.
All right. Have a good one, Steve.
And the rest of you, we'll see you next time.
All right.
Take care.
Thanks, Steve.